I'll have a lot of shocks come in and like the adjusters are maxed out. The manufacturers don't really explain it that well. I think your suspension is more important than your motor, really. I think that's a misconception. Too soft, is the rebound too fast, too slow? If they're off center like that, then it blocks those ports. Rebound stack is right there. You got 2 shims. Pretty wild.
Yeah. In today's video, I am visiting Eric Seyfarth, owner of Shock Tech, at his shop. I wanted to do a video on kind of the basics of shock valving. In this video, we have Eric breaking down a shock and going over his knowledge and his experience with shock valving. And I asked him some questions in regard to suspension setup for myself and for customers.
Yep. So tapers down.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Monstrous rebound stacker.
All right, what are you measuring?
I was just measuring the shim size, so overall the diameter and the thickness.
And you were saying
they run
the rebound one that you were...
Rebound stack is right there. You got 2 shims.
2 shims.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, and this is a stock QS3 from Fox off the 2025 Catalyst, I believe.
But the shims will bend, obviously, with the compression pressing the shock down. So they slowly bend up, which allows the fluid to go through, and that regulates your speed, you know, and the force needed to compress the shock. Same goes for rebound. And how, you know, fast you want it to rebound back, how slow you want it to rebound back. You know, you can even stage it so it comes in slow, goes out faster, vice versa. Again, on these ones, they're not using a lot of rebound shims. Most of it's done through the actual rebound control. So on your compression stroke, I know it's upside down, but when it comes down, your oil goes, there's 3 ports. There's 3 big ones, right? There, and that's where your oil flows through into the small bypass.
As the shock's compressing
Correct.
That way.
Yeah.
And
then obviously rebound is vice versa.
Right.
And also it flows through the rod itself.
And that's the compression stack,
Yeah, and through the little ports here.
You would think it's the other way. You'd think the compression stack would be here.
Right.
Like, just, that's where my mind thinks it would
bottom.
go. Yeah,
Correct.
but it's in fact the other way around. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why when I was putting it together, I was like, oh, wait, hold on. No.
Yeah.
Here's what a shock valving chart typically looks like. This is used to track stock setups that are in a shock when initially broken down. And then if there are any changes made, this is also where it can be useful to write down what the changes are. From top to bottom, the number 1 row is the closest shim to the piston head. And from left to right is the full diameter of the shim to the thickness of the shim. What I think is super weird is these are measured in inches. For example, a diameter could be 1.3 inches and a thickness could be 8 or 8 thousandths of an inch, 0.008. Any changes would be written on the left or right as indicated by changes on the chart shown on the screen.
The first shims you see closest to the piston, your oil's going to be flowing through. This is a bypass shim. But the oil flows through those ports, you know, for your compression stroke when the rod goes down. So those are the first shims that are going to open or be affected by the oil flowing through there. Fox uses these bypass in there, so at very low speed or even at static when you're moving it around, the shocks will move and the suspension will move. Some of the race sleds, previous race sleds, you take them out and you run, like snowcross, you don't run those. So there is no bypass, you push it all through the stack. But anyways, so they ran some lighter ones there, so your initial set stroke is gonna be a little bit softer. And then usually I'll just assemble them. There's a million different ways to do this.
Right.
A lot of people use a bolt, put them on there. Sometimes tuners will have racks, and they'll build stacks like that. And one thing I find all the time, I found it this week, is not assembling the pistons correctly. So the bypass or the bleed ports in the compression shim,
Yeah, these little
cutouts have to line up with the ports in the piston, because if you put them
off,
you can see through it. If they're off center like that, then it blocks those ports.
and it's gonna feel real
And you
stiff.
cannot believe that.
Yeah.
So when you assemble them, usually one of them sticks out a little bit further, and that way when you can drop it on, you can kind of line it up.
Gotcha.
And then even when you put your rebound stack on top of that, so you just drop them on, and you keep an eye on it and make sure it's in that open port right there. Backup washers on there.
How important, in your opinion, is shock valving?
It's fairly important. I mean, I think your suspension is more important than your motor, really. I think that's a misconception. Guys throw all this money at engines trying to make horsepower, but when you're racing, I mean, if you get to corners, bumps, stuff like that, you got to have the sled on the ground or ATV, side by side, whatever it may be. So you got to have the suspension dialed in. So I'd say it's very important.
You have your adjusters and you have valving. Like, what's the biggest difference in regard to that? Like,
well, the adjustability. So if you have a rebound or even a compression control, while you're riding, you can make adjustments as you go, depending on conditions. You may get to like a section that's all beat up. So I don't know, you may have to ride that for 20 miles. So you can adjust your suspension accordingly to that, as opposed to if you're riding, like in the county or something where it's just rear road beds and it's flat. You'd want it a little bit softer. So it all depends. Well, the shims, I guess the easier way to put it is you kind of build your valve package around the rider.
gotcha. So you can have your base. Say I have a really rough terrain race.
Yep.
We would probably add more, just like a few more, so that I don't run out of adjustment.
Correct.
With my compression
Yep.
clickers, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'll have a lot of shocks come in and like the adjusters are maxed out. And I always ask the people, why you got them maxed out? And that's where they like them. And I have to, kind of explain to them that we can valve them to be, to that standard wherever the settings are in the shock. But you can have your adjusters like at say 50%. So that's your baseline. You go off of like whatever the adjusters set at, that should be their 50%. That way they have the adjusters to kind of compensate, again, depending on conditions and stuff like that.
I think that's the biggest misconception as to why, like, valving could be shrugged off. It's like, oh, have adjusters.
Right.
Well, you will probably run out of adjustment.
Yeah.
And this one change can make the adjustments even more effective.
Yeah, but yeah, it's a lot of things. The manufacturers don't really explain it that well. So it's one of those things that you'll learn after you ride a little bit, I think. You notice, and then you start playing with things and you can make things better. And then it's like everything, it just evolves to more and more.
When looking at this, say for me as like a 170, or let's say 200 pounds with all my gear on, like what would you change looking at this? Is there like, can you eyeball it? Are there certain numbers that you need to?
I mean, for you in particular, I mean, I know what you guys do with the sled, how you ride, stuff like that. So in theory, you'd go through the stack and see, at least myself, I look to see what they came up with through the manufacturer, be it Articap players, whoever it may be, to see what their baseline is. Sometimes it's pretty close. Other times it's way in left field. The Cat ones, from the 24s, 25s are basically the same. That seems to be not that far off for most guys. We kind of tune around them being their weight and stuff like that, and use the stock, at least myself again, I use the stock one as kind of a guideline with them, or with you and with most of the riders, because it seems to work fairly decent. Sometimes you'll get stuff that's so far off you gotta completely redo it, and you go through a bunch of testing and stuff like that, unless you have a shock dyno, and then you can do it that way.
If someone were to send you their shocks and ask, hey, I want these revalved, would you ask them? You know what the sled is, you know what the shock is, you know all that stuff. Like,
Nothing really. Once I get their weight, you know, the sled, you know, type of riding they primarily do, just give me the shocks. And then once you take them apart, you can look at the stacks, see what there is there. And then a lot of stuff I refer to back in notes from stuff I've done before. You know, kind of once you develop a baseline, you know, that kind of works, and then kind of go off of that, you know, because the rider weight may vary. You know, this guy's 20 pounds more than that. You know, the last guy, so you make a couple adjustments with the shims, but a lot of times I'll use, you know, very similar setups. I ask questions too, like if somebody calls me or emails me, you know, they'll give me their weight and stuff, but, you know, I try and get feedback on their current setup. You know, is it too soft? Is the rebound too fast, too slow? To try and get as much feedback as you can to, you know, tune the shock really.
so you go off of your notes, and that kind of gives you guidance on the size and then where to put it in the stack. Correct. Just based off your notes. Okay. Yeah. Is there
because some stacks you get a shock. For example, what am I thinking of? Some stuff is notoriously soft. We'll say like an Arctic Cat, Fire Cat or something. The suspensions are soft in those, so you kind of know already. You know that, all right, even, you know, say the guy's like 200 pounds, all right, you already know the suspension's soft, so we got to do this. And then you kind of tailor fit it. Once you do it a bunch of times, you find out a baseline that works, and you just kind of go off of that. Sometimes you'll change springs and stuff too, to go along with it. Okay. I'll be honest with you, a lot of, especially with sleds that are like 10 years old or older, so you want to think about doing the springs as well at the same time, just because they will lose some of their tension.
How big of a difference would it be, say, we just added another 1.3 on the top?
Very minimal.
Very minimal, okay.
Yeah.
So
if you're really, for the average rider, they wouldn't notice.
Wouldn't notice,
yeah.
Okay.
But if you're really racing and you're on that edge, I guess you know what that's like and do. And you get to that point, you could feel it. You know, even the same way with some of the adjustments, rebound and compression, you know, just those small increments, some riders can feel it, you know, and same with chassis too. Some of the chassis are way more prone to, you know, you can feel little changes.
Yeah.
I think the newer ones are way more than like older chassis.
Gotcha.
You know, mostly the weight and how they're designed now. The just subtle differences make a huge difference.
Cool.
But yeah, a lot of the fine tuning stuff is for guys that are very finicky, and really a lot of it's feel. Yeah. You know, when they're riding it and they can really feel those setups and just the little differences.
You just have to try them though, right?
Yeah, a lot of it is, yeah.
Okay.
Unless, I mean, you can dyno it too. Obviously, then you have the charts to show you what it's doing, which is awesome. But I still think a lot of it is by feel and stuff.
It's more of like a measurement. Like
it's a tuning tool.
It'll show, you can show the change based on adding, removing shims, rebound, all that stuff. And having that data compared to how it feels riding just gives more information.
Right.
So then you keep track of that for the next time. You can go, okay, well, if I added another shim, it would probably change it this much on the dyno, which then would translate to this on the track. Okay. So
there's a lot of different variables, you know, even with the shims, you got oil weight, nitrogen charge. So there's a lot of different factors, which it can be overwhelming.
For sure.
You know, especially if you start chasing your tail and just nothing keeps working. So yeah, it can be very discouraging. That's why, you know, I'm like little changes. And once you start going in that right direction, try and, you know, go with that. But usually, you know, once you develop that baseline, and that's the toughest thing for a lot of guys, is finding that baseline that works, and then you can just kind of make little adjustments off of that, depending on course conditions, stuff like that.